The signal was unlike anything I'd encountered in my 4 years doing this. Work unencrypted, unencoded, deliberately broadcast for everyone to hear. When I ran it through my linguistic databases, nothing matched until I pulled up the Vilhari dialect library. I'd spent months building. The words began to resolve, and that's when my stomach dropped. The Vilhari Dominion, one of the Midram's older powers, had never sounded afraid in any transmission I'd ever intercepted, but this signal was different, raw and urgent in a way their formal, arrogant communications never were. It was a prayer, a literal one cast across every frequency band into deep space, directed at beings they called the ordained, a spiritual authority they only invoked in ceremonial context, never in open transmission. Calling on the ordained meant you'd exhausted every other option. As I translated line by line, the message became clear. The Vilhari were begging for mercy because they'd invaded the Ethri, a small civilization with no military capability, and they'd done something they couldn't take back. The Ethri's only response had been to send a message to Earth. Now the Vilhari were broadcasting prayers into the void, because they'd learned what that meant. The word Terran appeared throughout the transmission like an incantation, and I understood immediately why they were terrified. I flagged it as priority red and called Commander Lark, who answered almost before the second tone finished. He arrived minutes later in his undershirt, hair disheveled from running, and I played him the translation. He read it twice in silence, then asked if I was certain of the accuracy. I confirmed 94% confidence on the core text, with the emotional register reading at absolute certainty. They're terrified, I explained, more frightened of what Earth's protection pact means than of their own gods. Owen immediately pulled out his personal comm and sent an urgent dispatch to Fleet Command with a priority flag that would wake someone no matter the hour or rank. He told me to pack my kit. Fleet would need someone who could speak both Vilhari and E3 dialect fragments, and I was the only one on station who qualified. Then he said it, they're sending the expeditionary hammer, and I understood exactly what that meant. The third expeditionary hammer wasn't a diplomatic unit or a peacekeeping force. It was something far more serious. I went to my bunk and started gathering my things: translation kit, personal tablet, uniform set. Then, almost without thinking, I pulled my service rifle from underneath and ran a function check. It had been 2 years since I'd fired anything but range targets, but it was clean and ready, heavier than I remembered. I packed it anyway. 6 hours later, I was on a transport, burning hard toward the rendezvous point, where the Relentless and her battle group were already accelerating into position. Through the porthole above my bunk, I watched the stars shift as we came up to speed, and somewhere ahead the Vilhari were still praying. I wondered if they understood that the thing they feared most was already moving toward them. I wondered if it would matter. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep but couldn't. The stars kept moving, and somewhere in the dark a fleet was answering a call that no prayer could stop. The Relentless wasn't beautiful. She was wide through the middle, dark gray, bristling with sensor arrays and weapon platforms so densely mounted they looked grown rather than designed. She wasn't built to impress. She was built to arrive and be the last thing that needed 2. I came aboard through the secondary hangar and was taken straight to the briefing deck without time to find my bunk, a fleet adjutant named Derek Moss walking me through the ship. Moss moved at a pace that made it clear nobody here was going to wait for anyone. He told me General Hale wanted me in the command briefing in 40 minutes, not looking at me as we moved through corridors that smelled like metal and recycled air. When I mentioned I hadn't slept in 30 hours, he just said nobody had and kept walking. I'd heard of General Helen Hale before meeting her. Most of the fleet had. She was 61, commanding expeditionary operations since before I finished basic training, and she wore her prosthetic left arm without any cosmetic cover, just bare titanium from the elbow down, a reminder of the Corvus engagement 14 years ago. She wasn't tall or physically intimidating, just short white hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. When I entered the briefing room, she was studying a data display with a kind of focus calm you'd see in someone working through a puzzle. She glanced up at me once, nodded, and returned to the display, telling me to sit. There were 6 other officers present. I only recognized Commander Grant Ellis, the fleet tactical lead, who had that particular stillness that comes with years of combat planning experience. He was watching the main display with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. General Hale mentioned they'd picked up the same Vilhari signal I had, but they'd also received the original E3 distress message 11 days ago through the Article 7 relay, and they'd been moving ever since. I hadn't known about those 11 days, so I asked what the E3 message contained. She turned the display toward me so I could read it. The message was shorter than I'd expected. The E3 didn't frame the invasion in political or military language. Instead, they described what was happening to their people, their cities, the structures their ancestors had built over millennia. They wrote about children who couldn't understand why strangers were tearing down walls that had stood since before recorded history. At the end, using the formal register of old E3 treaty language, they invoked Earth's protection under Article 7 of the Interspecies Accord, which humanity had signed 40 years ago as a guarantee to any civilization registered as non-military under galactic law. Signing that accord meant making a specific promise. If anyone came for those who couldn't defend themselves, you would come for them in return, not to mediate or negotiate, but to act. I set the display down and asked how long until we reached E3 Prime. 17 days. At our current speed, Ellis said, which meant the Vilhari ambassador's shuttle would intercept us in about 4 days. They were already moving toward us. Hale explained without emotion, wanting to talk, offering reparations, concessions, tribunals, formal apologies in multiple languages, anything that would let everyone leave with their dignity intact. I understood then that we weren't going to accept any of it. Hale met my eyes and confirmed it. We'd listen professionally and courteously, but we were going to continue anyway. The Vilhari shuttle arrived on day 13, a white diplomatic vessel marked with their symbol for open hands, surrender, and conversation both. 7 escort drones flanked it, a sign they were still wary despite their peaceful intentions. The ambassador himself was Sar with stars, a name chosen at a pivotal moment in his life rather than given at birth. Tall even for his species, with 6 limbs and the facial markings of high diplomatic rank. He was brought to the main briefing room. Derek Moss escorted him in with 2 security officers, and I was already at the translation console while General Hale sat at the head of the table with Commander Ellis beside her, just the 3 of us, no recording officials, no delegates, no ceremony. When SAR with Stars looked around, I caught the subtle shift in his expression. He'd expected something formal, something that looked like a proper diplomatic process. Instead, he found 3 humans at a table. He settled into the respectful Valhari posture and began speaking at length, while I fed a quiet translation to Hale. He was a skilled orator, eloquent and methodical. He presented the Valhari case precisely. The E3 system held minerals critical to their energy infrastructure. Diplomatic requests for shared access had been refused, and the Resource Council had decided to take it by force despite objections from the diplomatic corps. He acknowledged the harm caused, offered substantial reparations, and proposed an independent tribunal to determine accountability. Throughout it all, he kept his gaze fixed on General Hale, who remained completely still. No nods, no frowns, no small acknowledgments that she was following along. She simply watched. When he finished, she slid a single data pad across the table. It displayed the cumulative count of E3 civilian casualties since the occupation began, not as an abstract number, but broken down by region, age group, and cause, updating in real time as new reports arrived. He stared at it for a long moment, and when he finally looked up, something had shifted in him. The eloquence remained, but the confidence behind it had fractured into uncertainty. He said quietly that they were prepared to make this right, and she replied that she knew they were, then turned the pad face down and folded her hands, leaving the thought unfinished. Now she's laying out the reality. The E3 invoked Article 7, which binds them to respond. This isn't a negotiation about whether they act or what terms govern withdrawal. His forces will leave E3 space, period. The only question is how. When he suggests they have 400,000 soldiers in the system, she meets it with patient certainty, the kind that comes from having already played this scenario through to its conclusion. She's not hostile, just immovable, and she's about to explain why his numbers don't actually change the calculus. Ellis's point lands differently now. She treats every negotiation with basic humanity, even when the answer is no. As we approach E3 Prime, I'm struck by the contrast. 4 days of travel, and now we're descending into a city still burning from conflicts that started weeks ago. The heat hits first, not from our engines, but from the fires themselves. 3 districts still smoldering, smoke rising in gray columns against an orange sky. The smell cuts through my helmet filter. That particular combination of scorch, stone, and organic material that I've only known from training until now. I'm embedded with Strike Team Iron Cradle under Captain Finn, a sharp operator who checks her tactical map constantly. 22 soldiers, one objective: the central garrison, where the Valhari have dug into what used to be a cultural archive. There's no warning coming, no declaration, no courtesy. General Hale was explicit about that. When we touch down, the Valhari respond immediately. They're professional, organized, everything a military force should be, but they've never encountered the way we fight. Finn's team doesn't advance in lines or use the standard patterns their systems are built to counter. Instead, we move in overlapping arcs, pairs covering different angles, advancing and retreating in what looks chaotic but is actually a doctrine refined over centuries of human warfare. The Velhari commanders can't predict our movements because the pattern they're looking for doesn't exist. I move with the second element through an abandoned market street past overturned stalls and cracked paving stones. The decorative tiles shattered beneath us. Finn signals a halt at a plaza corner, and I press against the wall beside her, watching as she checks her map. She calls out positions for the archive. Assault, Cole takes the elevated. Emplacement, Pete handles ground level. Entry, and I stay on her left. Cole acknowledges with a gesture and moves out. Pete gives me a nod that feels like both introduction and reassurance. Next 90 seconds explode into the loudest moment of my life, though it's not chaos, it's something far more precise. Every person knows exactly where they are and what they're doing, but the sound is enormous, and the air moves in ways that make me feel impossibly small. At one point, I'm pressed against a column that's been standing here for 3,000 years, and I have this brief, strange thought about what a communication sergeant is doing in a place like this. When the noise stops, the archive is secured, 11 minutes from touchdown to complete control. The remaining Velhari soldiers, 43 of them, some injured, are disarmed and placed under guard in the lower level. Finn's team moves through the building with professional efficiency, doing what's necessary and nothing more. I find myself standing in what used to be the main reading room. A call comes through on my personal communicator, flagged as incoming on the Velhari command frequency. It's a senior officer, Field Commander Avitson from the 2nd Garrison, requesting to speak with my commanding officer about terms of cessation. I respond in Velhari, which catches him off guard, and when he asks who he's speaking to, I give him my name and rank. He realizes I'm a translator and seems momentarily thrown by that fact when he mentions they'd sent a signal before our fleet arrived, asking for mercy from the ordained. I tell him I was the one who received it. He's trying to establish that they recognize the severity of their actions and were seeking mediation. But as I look out the archive windows at the smoke columns and broken streets of the city below, the weight of what that signal meant becomes impossible to ignore. I explained to him that while his plea for mercy did reach us, the E3's signal arrived 11 days earlier, and mercy has conditions, one of them being timing. When he asks what our terms are, I relay the question, the chain, and receive the response within minutes. The Velhari forces must stand down and assemble at collection points, all equipment powered down and surrendered, and every E3 detainee released immediately. Noncompliance means we continue operations. Zone accepts, and the garrison formally surrenders at 8:31. Afterward, I move through the archives, lower levels, while Finn's team organizes the prisoner assembly. The shelves are mostly intact, crystalline recording media scattered, but largely undamaged. The Velhari didn't deliberately destroy what was here, which is something small to hold on to. I discover 16 survivors in a maintenance corridor beneath the east wing, adults, and 3 young ones, small and still in the darkness, watching me with large eyes that catch my helmet light. I dim the light, crouch to seem less threatening, and place my rifle down, with the barrel facing away, using fragments of E3 language mixed with the treaty words for safety and protection. I try to communicate that the fighting is over. One of the adults steps forward, a woman, small enough that her head barely reaches my shoulder. She studies me for a long moment, then touches my uniform sleeve once gently, like she's testing whether I'm real. She speaks a single word that my earpiece translates. Promised. I realize soldiers aren't trained for this, not for the weight of that moment when someone who's been terrified finally believes they're safe. I nod slowly, and she nods back. Through the ancient walls around us, I can hear the sounds of the battle still continuing outside. Now I'm taking in the scale of what we're facing next. The Valhari home system is the most heavily defended place I've ever encountered. Their orbital defenses are visible from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. Layered weapons platforms covering every possible approach, and behind it all, their fleet of over 600 ships, including 3 massive sovereign vessels designed to serve as mobile command centers and ultimate fortresses. We have 40 ships standing on the bridge. As we crossed into their system, I felt the weight of those numbers in a way that was purely, viscerally human. The tactical display made it clear we were outmatched, and significantly so. But then I looked at General Hale at the navigation console, and she had that same steady, present expression she always wore in briefings, reviewing casualties, eating lunch, completely unshaken. When she caught me watching, she told me to get some water. The Galactic Observers Council opened their channel almost immediately. Everyone was watching. The destruction of an E3 civilization was historic enough, but a direct Earth-Valhari engagement was apparently even more significant. The representative who appeared was Murren, tall and blue-gray, with senior mediatory markings, a species whose name translated roughly to calm voice. They addressed General Hale in Standard, and I realized the entire galaxy was about to see how we responded. Calm voice delivered the Council's message. They acknowledged our treaty commitment, commended the E3 recovery, and reported that the Valhari had agreed in principle to reparations and an accountability process. They strongly encouraged us to accept these terms and stand down. But Hale cut through the diplomatic language with a single question: whether the E3 themselves were satisfied with the arrangement. The pause that followed told me everything. Calm voice hadn't anticipated that, and they were scrambling to recalculate their position. When pressed directly, Calm voice admitted the E3 representative didn't consider the framework sufficient. Hale's response was immediate and decisive: neither did we. She closed the channel. Within moments, Commander Ellis reported the Valhari fleet was reforming into defensive arc around the planet. Hale ordered Operation Pale Morning executed, and I watched our 40 ships begin to split apart in a way that was nothing like the standard tactical formations I'd been briefed on. Something far more complex and coordinated than I'd anticipated from the abstract descriptions. The ships dispersed into 11 separate elements, each on its own heading and speed, each trajectory appearing random to any standard tactical system, but there was nothing random about it. This was an ancient human naval strategy refined over centuries of deep space warfare, designed specifically for moments when a smaller force needed to prevent a larger one from concentrating its full power. The logic was elegant. If you can't match their strength, you make it impossible for them to use all of it at once. You force them to respond to multiple threats simultaneously, while you prepare something they won't see coming. The Velhari commanders were about to discover what that meant. They reacted exactly as their centuries of military doctrine dictated, reorganizing their formation, dispatching intercept groups, executing every principle that had ever worked for them. But Pale Morning wasn't designed by someone who studied Velhari history. It was designed by someone who studied human history, specifically the brutal centuries when humans fought only each other, developing tactics against an enemy that thought exactly like they did. No alien civilization had ever endured that kind of crucible, that relentless refinement against a mirror image of themselves. The Velhari tactical framework had no category for what we were doing because nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. Our 11 elements didn't attack directly. They pressured, drew responses, fell back, shifted with each Velhari movement to cover the threats. Their formation fractured further, their command line stretched thinner. After 4 hours of this maneuvering, Ellis confirmed what we'd been working toward. Their sovereign ship was isolated, separated from the main carrier group by 80,000 km, cut off from supporting elements. Hale saw it immediately and gave the order to converge on their command cluster with full force, avoiding civilian infrastructure. Our 11 elements reversed course, and suddenly the Velhari were facing 40 ships in tight coordination, bearing down on their most critical vessels, while the rest of their fleet was too dispersed to respond. The next 3 hours unfolded on the bridge displays in ways I can describe only through what I witnessed and felt. I heard Velhari squadron commanders request disengagement 3 times, and each time Hale granted it without pursuit. She wasn't counting kills. She was forcing a surrender. On the tactical display, their formation collapsed not from destruction but from the weight of our convergence, ships pulling back, groups tightening around their sovereign vessels, a fleet designed to hold a system slowly accepting it was already lost. Then at hour 7, a channel opened on the sovereign frequency. An ancient voice spoke in formal high Velhari, the linguistic register reserved for official proclamations, addressing me directly as the Terran commander. It was High Sovereign Davin Thresh himself, invoking the right of sovereign parley. He acknowledged that his 40-year rule had been guided by beliefs about galactic conduct that he now recognized as mistaken, and he was appealing for mercy. Hale had me relay her response: "We accept the surrender. Terms will follow within the hour, but the mercy he seeks isn't ours to grant. It belongs to the E3. When the sovereign asked if they would give it, Hale turned the question back to me with her silence, and I found myself considering something I couldn't quite articulate. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that he'd have to ask them directly. After the channel closed, Commander Ellis noted the 40 Velhari ships standing down across the system, their weapons powered to minimal levels. Hale dismissed the significance of the Fleet size as merely a planning factor, not a conclusion, then ordered the terms. Sent to the sovereign staff with confirmation needed within 6 hours, and a direct line established to the E3 envoy. I remained at my station afterward, processing what had just happened. Standing there, I watched the Valhari home planet on the display, ancient and undefended now that its protective fleet had withdrawn. What struck me wasn't the tactical or strategic meaning of those 40 ships changing course, but something deeper. We traveled far from home to honor a commitment to strangers, walked into odds that shouldn't have favored us, and succeeded not through superior firepower or numbers, but through a way of thinking that only comes from the hardest education any civilization can receive: our own history. I finished my water and moved on. Now I'm finding Ellis to start the mountain of paperwork that comes after. Something like that. 6 months have passed since the engagement at the Valhari system, and I'm stationed here on E3 Prime as part of the transitional security detail. Long enough for markets to reopen, for children to return to public squares, for something broken to begin healing itself, though slowly and with effort. The work here is nothing like what I've done before. It's quiet, organizational, the kind of coordination that doesn't look significant from the outside, but that I've come to see as perhaps the most crucial work there is. I've read the damage assessments from when we first arrived, walked those same streets, and tried to hold both versions of this place in my mind at once: what it was and what it's becoming now. It's imperfect and full of unexpected complications, but it's alive in that fragile, recovering way that matters more than anything easy ever could. Over these 5 months, I've learned the E3 language properly, not just the fragments and emergency phrases I cobbled together in those first days, but the actual structure of their thought, which is built on philosophical frameworks so old and precise they don't map cleanly onto human language. What struck me early on is that they don't have a word for revenge at all. What gets translated that way actually means correction, returning something disrupted to its proper state. It's neutral, administrative, the way Carpenter talks about repair. That distinction mattered when I attended the official transition ceremony last week as the Earth Force liaison. The ceremony took place in the rebuilt Reading Hall of the Cultural Archive, the same space where I'd stood on the first morning with a rifle at my feet and a small hand on my sleeve. The E3 restoration team had spent 4 months repairing it using materials from the original construction records, but they deliberately left the ceiling scars visible. The damage was part of the record now. When the Valhari delegation arrived on their formal diplomatic transport, clean and white without the military escort drones that had accompanied Sorrow of Stars 6 months earlier, there were 4 of them, a junior diplomatic officer named Calavith and 2 others whose names I'm still processing. Sorrow of Stars himself was fundamentally different, not in appearance but in how he carried himself, moving with careful deliberation and watching everything with the weariness of someone whose understanding of the world has shifted. I met him at the archive entrance and walked with him inside, and for a long moment he said nothing, just taking in the building, the street beyond with its open market stalls, and the E3 moving through the morning light. When he finally spoke, he was remembering his last visit to this world. 3 years before the invasion, when he'd come as part of a diplomatic advance party assessing mineral rights, and the archive had been full of people, students, researchers, families. He told me he'd noted the archive, their resource assessment report, classified it as culturally significant and worth preserving during any acquisition operation. He'd written that notation himself. I understood then the particular weight someone carries when they work to protect one small thing within a process that destroys everything else around it. And I told him he needed to tell the E3 that directly, not me. The ceremony that followed was conducted. Informal E3 register, ceremonial, deliberate, precise about every word and its placement, and I followed most of it, with help from a young E3 diplomat when I needed it. The Velhari presented comprehensive reparations documentation that had been 3 months in preparation, reviewed by the Galactic Observers Council and the new interim governance covering extraction, rights reconstruction funding, and an independent accountability process for individual officials. When the E3 Council accepted it, there was no applause, but rather a 15-second silence, the way they honor something truly significant. I stood watching from the edge of the hall, thinking about everything that had to converge for this moment, the signal. In the dark, the cold coffee and humming light, the transmitted prayer that became something else, the water on a briefing table. 40 ships against 614. A small hand and one word. During the open address, Sorrow Stars spoke in E3, a language he'd been studying since the surrender, his accent rough but his choice to speak without a translator, and in the personal register rather than formal one, creating a profound quiet in the hall. He was beginning to articulate something he'd come to understand over the past 6 months about how strength had always been measured in Velhari culture. He continued, explaining that strength wasn't about capacity or control or accumulation, but about commitment, not what you could do, but what you were willing to go very far to keep. When he said it, he looked directly at me, and I held his gaze. After the ceremony ended, people gathered in the restored courtyard where the E3 had arranged food in patterns that held meaning for the occasion. Ren walked me through some of the symbolism as we stood at the courtyard's edge, pointing out the significance of the arrangements. Ren explained that the long row of dishes represented continuity, things that existed before and would exist after, while the cluster in the center held food for the present moment, which the E3 believe is the most fragile of the 3 temporal states. The past is fixed, the future is open, but the present is where things can go wrong. I remarked that this was a very precise way to worry, and she met my observation with a steady gaze, nodding that the E3 had 12,000 years to practice such precision. Later, as the formal parts of the day wound down and the courtyard grew quieter, Sorrow of Stars found me. He mentioned that I'd been here 5 months now, and when I reminded him of General Hale's commitment to the transition period, he grew thoughtful. He'd been sitting with a question for a long time, he said, and asked whether my people ever prayed before everything changed, before the signal, before Article 7 and the fleet, whether we ever sent words into the dark asking for something beyond our own reach. I looked at the archive building before answering, thinking about how to give him the true answer rather than the Comfortable one, we had prayed yes and for centuries, but nothing came. When we faced serious, long-lasting troubles, nothing responded or appeared to help us. He watched some young E3 examining the food arrangements with curiosity and asked what we did instead. We argued about it for a long time, I told him honestly. Some of us kept praying while others stopped. The ones who continued mostly did both. They prayed and they worked, which turned out to be the most effective approach. He made that quiet, thoughtful sound I'd learned was the Valhari equivalent of a laugh, then said something that reframed everything. From their perspective, they sent a prayer, and we came, so that looks like an answer. I pointed out that from our perspective, it just looked like a Tuesday. We both sat with that for a moment, watching the afternoon light warm the courtyard stones. But then my communicator chimed with a priority red signal from the deep space relay, the kind that only activates for emergencies from civilizations under the interspecies protection framework. The message had a familiar structure: small, non-military civilization facing an aggressor, calling for help from the only party they thought might answer. At the bottom, in the standard format, all registered civilizations used for formal invocations, was a single word: Terran. I read it twice, closed my eyes for 3 seconds, then opened a direct channel to the relentless. General Hale answered immediately, and I forwarded the signal. She reviewed it in silence, her voice steady as always when she asked for my orders. I told her to stand by, and I could hear the ship beginning to shift from ready to moving, its operational systems coming online. Hale told me to report to the hangar at 600 and we leave at 700. The channel closed. I was standing in the courtyard of an ancient archive on a recovering world, the afternoon light still warm on the stone, when Sorrow of Stars approached and asked about the signal. I told him we were going, and he looked out at the courtyard, at the E3 studying their ceramic arrangements, at the building still standing, at the scars in the ceiling the restoration team had chosen to preserve. He said something that stuck with me. Power isn't about making others afraid of you, but about making them believe you'll actually come when called. That when a signal goes out, something will move. I picked up my kit and looked at the archive one last time, thinking about the weight of that kind of responsibility and about a question that had been asked long ago. A species with nothing, no weapons, no fleet, no defense, had sent a signal into the dark, not knowing if anything was there to answer. I thought about what it meant to be that answer, not a perfect one, not simple or painless, but real and present and already moving. I forwarded the signal to General Hale and started walking toward the ship. We were already on our way.